The hardest part about losing everything isn't the silence that comes after. It's realizing the only one still waiting for you is a dog. Jack Callahan stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the county courthouse. As gray clouds hung low over the hills of West Virginia, at 67 years old he had survived military deployments, long winters, and more hardships than most people could imagine. But nothing had prepared him for the feeling sitting in his chest that afternoon. 35 years of marriage had ended with a few signatures and a stack of legal documents. The house was gone. The retirement investments were gone. The future he thought he understood had vanished before he could stop it. All that remained was an aging pickup truck, two worn suitcases, and the German Shepherd sitting quietly in the passenger seat beside him. Ranger watched him with steady amber eyes as if he already understood something Jack was still trying to accept. Jack opened the truck door and climbed inside. Rain tapped softly against the roof. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ranger leaned over and rested his head against Jack's shoulder. Jack let out a slow breath and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "looks like it's just you and me now." Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. That small sound somehow felt more comforting than anything another person could have said. An hour later, Charleston disappeared behind them. The city lights faded into the rearview mirror, while the road climbed steadily toward the Appalachian mountains. Jack drove without turning on the radio. Ranger sat upright beside him like a silent guardian, occasionally glancing over to make sure his owner was still there. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world became. Office buildings gave way to forests. Highways narrowed into winding mountain roads. The scent of wet pine drifted through the cracked window. Jack had not returned to his family's land in nearly 20 years. After his father passed away, life had pulled him elsewhere. Work, marriage, responsibilities. There had always been another reason to stay away. Now there was nowhere else left to go. As dusk settled across the mountains, the truck finally turned onto an old gravel road nearly swallowed by weeds and brush. The tires crunched over loose stone as towering pines closed in around them. Ranger suddenly stood and pressed his nose toward the window. His ears lifted. Something about the place had caught his attention immediately. "You remember this place?" Jack asked with a faint smile. Ranger's tail moved slowly. Half a mile later, the trees opened into a clearing. The old Callahan homestead stood waiting beneath the fading light. The cabin looked tired. Weathered boards covered the walls. Part of the porch sagged toward the ground. The barn leaned slightly to one side. Yet despite the years of neglect, something about the place still felt alive. Jack stepped out of the truck and stared at it for several seconds. Memories drifted through his mind like ghosts. His father splitting firewood, summer evenings on the porch, the smell of fresh-cut hay. Ranger jumped down beside him and immediately began exploring the property. The dog circled the cabin, sniffed the barn, then stopped. Jack noticed his posture change. Ranger was staring toward the hill behind the cabin. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still. His ears were pointed forward. His attention locked on to something hidden beyond the trees. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked. Ranger didn't move. He simply kept staring toward the dark hillside as twilight settled across the mountains. And for the first time that day, Jack felt something other than loss. He felt curiosity, because somewhere beyond that hill, something had already caught Ranger's attention, and neither of them knew it yet. But the mountains had been waiting a very long time for Jack Callahan to come home. Jack slept better than he expected that first night. The mountain air was cool, the cabin was quiet, and for the first time in months there were no lawyers, no paperwork, and no painful conversations waiting for him in the morning. When sunlight finally slipped through the dusty window, he opened his eyes and listened. Birds, wind moving through pine trees, nothing else. He sat up slowly and stretched his stiff shoulders. "Not exactly a luxury resort," he muttered, "but I have slept in worse places." Ranger was already awake. The German Shepherd stood near the front door, alert and waiting. His tail wagged once when Jack entered the living room. "Good morning to you, too." Jack opened the door and fresh mountain air rushed inside. Ranger immediately trotted outside and headed toward the back of the property. Jack watched him disappear toward the hill. "You really like that spot, do you not?" he called after him. The dog did not even look back. After making coffee on the old stove, Jack spent the morning inspecting the cabin. The roof needed repairs. Several porch boards would have to be replaced. The barn looked like it was surviving mostly through stubbornness. Around noon, he found an old hammer hanging exactly where his father used to keep it. Jack smiled faintly. Some things never move. He spent the next few hours clearing brush and hauling broken wood away from the porch. Every so often, he glanced toward the hill. Every time he looked, Ranger was there, watching, sniffing, walking circles across the same patch of ground. By late afternoon, Jack finally wiped the sweatin from his forehead and walked toward the hill himself. Ranger stood halfway up the slope, staring at the ground. "All right, soldier," Jack said. "Show me what is so interesting." The dog immediately lowered his nose and began sniffing again. Jack crouched beside him. The earth looked normal. Grass, moss, a few rocks, nothing unusual. "You have been staring at dirt all day." Ranger suddenly began scratching at the ground with one paw. Dirt scattered behind him. Jack laughed. "That is your big mystery?" The dog ignored him and continued digging. Faster now, more focused. "You found a squirrel?" Jack asked. "Because if this is about a squirrel, I am going back to work." Ranger kept digging. 10 minutes later, the hole was nearly a foot deep. Jack's amusement slowly faded. The dog was not playing. He was working. There was a difference, and Jack knew it. He had spent years training dogs during military assignments. Ranger only became this focused when he believed something mattered. Jack stepped closer. "What do you smell?" Ranger barked once without stopping. Then suddenly his paw struck something solid. A sharp metallic sound echoed beneath the dirt. Both of them froze. Jack frowned. "What was that?" Ranger immediately attacked the spot with renewed energy. Dirt flew in every direction. Jack dropped to one knee and brushed soil aside with his hand. For several seconds he saw nothing. Then a narrow dark edge appeared beneath the earth. Metal, perfectly straight, perfectly flat. Jack's heartbeat quickened. That should not have been there. He cleared away more dirt carefully. The metal surface continued beneath the ground farther than he could see. Ranger stepped back and stared at him expectantly. "No," Jack whispered. "There is no way." He grabbed a nearby stick and scraped away another layer of soil. More metal appeared, bigger now, wider, deliberately placed. Ranger's ears lifted. The German shepherd looked unusually proud of himself. Jack sat back on his heels and stared at the object hidden beneath decades of dirt. Whatever it was, it did not belong on a forgotten mountain hillside. And, for the first time since returning home, he realized Ranger had not been staring at the hill. He had been trying to tell him something. Jack remained kneeling beside the hole for nearly a minute, staring at the strip of metal exposed beneath the soil. Ranger sat beside him, panting lightly, looking far too pleased with himself. "You knew it was here, did you not?" Jack asked. Ranger tilted his head. "Yeah, that is about the answer I expected." The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the hillside. Jack glanced toward the cabin, then back at the buried object. Common sense told him to wait until morning. Curiosity refused to listen. "All right," he said as he stood. "One more hour." He walked quickly to the barn and searched through decades of forgotten tools. Most were rusty. Some were broken. Eventually, he found an old shovel and a heavy pry bar, leaning against the wall. Good enough. Ranger followed him back up the hill immediately. The German shepherd moved with unusual excitement, staying close as Jack began digging. Dirt and roots slowly gave way to more metal. The deeper he went, the stranger the discovery became. This was not a piece of farm equipment. It was too large, too deliberate. Nearly 45 minutes later, the full outline finally emerged. Jack stepped back and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Well, I will be." Ranger barked once. Buried beneath the hillside was a massive steel hatch. It measured roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet long. Rust covered parts of the surface, but the structure itself looked remarkably intact. Near one corner sat a recessed metal handle. Jack crouched beside it. Who puts a hatch in the middle of a mountain? Ranger immediately pawed at the edge. Easy. If there is something down there, it has been waiting a long time. Another 5 minutes will not hurt. He wrapped his fingers around the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. The hatch did not move an inch. Jack frowned. Figures. He wedged the pry bar beneath the edge and leaned his weight onto it. At first, nothing happened. Then a deep metallic groan echoed from beneath the ground. Both Jack and Ranger froze. The sound was unmistakable. Hollow space. Ranger barked excitedly. Jack's pulse quickened. "You hear that too?" He pushed harder. Another groan. Then a sudden crack as decades of dirt and roots finally released their grip. Slowly, very slowly, the hatch lifted. Cool air drifted upward from the darkness below. Jack stepped back instinctively. Ranger moved closer, staring into the opening. Neither of them made a sound. Jack grabbed the flashlight hanging from his belt and aimed the beam downward. The light disappeared into darkness before finally striking concrete walls. A metal ladder descended nearly 15 feet underground. Beyond that was a floor, a room, maybe more than one room. Jack felt every engineering instinct from his military career wake up at once. "This is not a storm shelter," he whispered. Ranger glanced up at him. "No farmer builds something like this." He swept the flashlight beam deeper. Concrete, reinforced steel, dust, shadows. Then something caught the edge of the light. A faded sign mounted on the far wall. The letters were difficult to read from above. Jack narrowed his eyes and adjusted the beam. Slowly the words became visible. His breath caught. Ranger looked from the opening back to Jack. "You are not going to believe this, partner." The German shepherd whined softly. Jack stared into the darkness below. Painted across the wall, barely visible beneath decades of dust, was a single name, Harold Callahan, his father's name. Jack remained at the edge of the hatch for several seconds, staring at the faded name painted on the wall below. Harold Callahan. His father had been gone for nearly 20 years, yet somehow his presence felt closer now than it had in decades. Ranger sat beside the opening, watching him carefully. "You knew there was something important down there, did not you?" Jack asked. Ranger responded with a soft huff. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The last light of day was fading fast. Common sense suggested waiting until morning, but Jack had spent too many years solving problems and chasing answers to walk away now. He grabbed a stronger flashlight from the truck and clipped it to his belt. Then he looked down at Ranger. "All right, partner, we go together." The German shepherd immediately stood. Jack stepped onto the ladder first. The steel rungs groaned softly beneath his weight as he descended into the cool darkness. 15 feet later, his boots touched solid concrete. Dust covered the floor in a thick layer. The air smelled old, but surprisingly clean. Moments later, Ranger landed beside him and began inspecting the room. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the chamber. Reinforced concrete walls, steel support beams, shelving units, wooden crates stacked neatly against one wall. Nothing looked random. Everything had been organized with military precision. Jack walked toward the faded sign. Beneath his father's name was a smaller line of text, almost hidden beneath dust. He brushed it clean with his sleeve. "Former site supervisor." Jack frowned. "Supervisor of what?" Ranger sniffed a nearby crate. Jack turned toward a metal desk standing against the far wall. Several folders sat on top beneath years of dust. He carefully opened the first one. Engineering diagrams, structural layouts, supply inventories. The next folder contained maps. The one after that contained reports. Every page carried official government markings. Jack slowly sat down in the old chair. "Dad, what were you involved in?" Ranger wandered toward another corner of the bunker. Meanwhile, Jack continued reading. Most of the documents dated back to the early 1960s. Cold War years, civil defense planning, emergency infrastructure, hidden supply sites scattered across remote regions of the country. Then he found a thin notebook tucked beneath a stack of papers. The cover immediately caught his attention. Personal notes, Harold Callahan. Jack opened it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's. The first few pages described maintenance schedules and inspections. Then one sentence made Jack stop. "If you are reading this, it means the mountain finally gave up its secret." Jack stared at the words. His father had expected someone to find this place someday. He turned another page. More notes, more observations. Then a name appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. Project Sentinel Ridge. Jack had never heard those words before in his life. He flipped forward, searching for an explanation. There was none, only references. Site updates, equipment transfers, security checks. Suddenly, Ranger barked sharply from across the room. Jack looked up. The dog stood beside a large steel cabinet built directly into the wall. His ears were forward, his attention fixed on something. Jack closed the journal and walked over. The cabinet door was slightly open, just enough to reveal a folded document sticking out from inside. Jack carefully pulled it free and unfolded the yellowed paper. Across the top, stamped in faded black letters, were two words that instantly sent a chill through him. Project Sentinel Ridge. Jack carried the document and his father's journal back to the cabin. Long after darkness had settled across the mountains, Ranger walked beside him, occasionally glancing up as if making sure he was keeping pace. The old cabin felt different now. It was no longer just a place to hide from the world. It had become part of a mystery. Jack spread the papers across the kitchen table and lit a lantern. "All right, Dad," he said quietly. "Let us see what you were trying so hard to protect." Ranger lay beside the table but remained alert. The journal revealed little about Project Sentinel Ridge itself. Every time Harold Callahan mentioned the project, entire sections appeared to be missing. Some pages had been removed completely. Others ended abruptly in the middle of sentences. Jack frowned. "You did that on purpose, did not you?" He flipped through another section. Maintenance logs, equipment inspections, supply transfers. Then one note caught his attention. The site must remain operational even if forgotten. Jack leaned back in his chair. Forgotten. The word stayed with him. The next morning he made a decision. He would rebuild both the homestead and the bunker. If his father had devoted years of his life to protecting the place, then it deserved better than decay. The days that followed settled into a routine. Jack repaired broken sections of the cabin roof. He reinforced the porch. He cleared brush from around the barn. Ranger remained close during every project. Sometimes the German shepherd carried dropped tools back to him. Other times he simply sat nearby watching. "You know," Jack said one afternoon while replacing fence posts, "you are starting to look more like a foreman than a dog." Ranger barked once. That was not a promotion. The dog seemed pleased anyway. Every evening they returned to the bunker. Jack cleaned decades of dust from equipment and shelves. Several generators still appeared intact. Water tanks remained connected. The deeper he explored, the more impressed he became. Whoever designed the facility had expected it to survive for generations. 1 week later, something happened that changed how the local community viewed them. Jack was repairing a section of fencing near the forest when Ranger suddenly sprinted toward the trees. Ranger! The dog disappeared into the woods. Moments later, distant barking echoed through the valley. Jack followed the sound and eventually found Ranger standing beside a frightened young boy no older than 8. The child looked relieved the moment he saw Jack. "Are you okay, son?" Jack asked gently. The boy nodded. "I got lost." Ranger sat proudly beside him. Half an hour later, Jack returned the child to his family near the main road. The boy's older brother hugged him tightly. Their mother wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Jack shook his head and pointed toward Ranger. "Thank him. He did the hard part." News traveled quickly through Pine Ridge. Within days, people were talking about the veteran on the mountain and the German shepherd who found a missing child. Then one afternoon, Jack drove into town for supplies. As he loaded lumber into his truck, an unfamiliar man approached him outside the hardware store. The stranger wore expensive hiking boots that looked brand new. He smiled politely. "You are Jack Callahan, right?" Jack nodded cautiously. The man glanced toward the mountains behind town. "I hear your family owns quite a bit of land up there." Something about the question immediately made Jack uneasy, and when he looked down, Ranger was already watching the stranger with unusual attention. The stranger extended a hand. "Name is Preston Whitmore." Jack shook it briefly. The grip felt practiced, the kind used in boardrooms rather than mountain towns. "What can I do for you?" Jack asked. Preston smiled. "I represent a development group interested in acquiring land throughout the Appalachian region." Ranger remained seated beside Jack, watching every movement. "That so?" Jack replied. "That is right. We have heard your property sits in a very desirable location." Jack closed the tailgate of his truck. "Funny, nobody thought it was desirable 6 months ago." Preston chuckled politely. "Markets change." Ranger suddenly stood, his ears pointed forward. Preston glanced at the dog. "He does not seem to like me." "He usually likes honest people," Jack answered calmly. For the first time, Preston's smile weakened. "Well, if you ever consider selling, there is serious money available." Jack climbed into the truck. "I am not selling. Everyone has a number." "Not everyone." Ranger jumped into the passenger seat. As Jack drove away, he noticed Preston watching them in the rearview mirror. The encounter stayed with him the entire drive back to the mountain. Something felt off. When he reached the cabin, Ranger immediately headed toward the hill. Jack followed. "You got a bad feeling too?" The dog barked once. They spent the afternoon inside the bunker. Jack continued organizing documents while Ranger explored corners of the facility. Several hours later, Jack discovered another reference to Project Sentinel Ridge, buried inside an engineering report. The document described emergency infrastructure, supply networks, and communication systems designed to remain operational for decades. Yet entire sections had been removed. Someone had deliberately hidden the most important information. "What were you protecting, Dad?" Jack asked quietly. Ranger suddenly barked from the far end of the bunker. Jack walked over. The German shepherd stood near a concrete wall partially hidden behind metal shelving. At first it looked ordinary. Then Jack noticed faint scrape marks on the floor. He moved the shelving aside. Behind it stood a heavy steel door built directly into the wall. No handle, no visible lock, just a narrow seam running through the concrete. Jack stared at it. Now that should not be there. Ranger sniffed the bottom edge repeatedly. Jack ran his flashlight across the surface. A small metal plate was mounted beside the door. Most of the writing had faded, but a few words remained visible. "Restricted access. Sentinel Ridge operations." Jack felt a chill run through him. This was not listed on any blueprint he had found, which meant either the plans were incomplete or this room had been intentionally concealed. He examined the edges carefully. The door appeared sealed from the inside. Whatever lay beyond it had remained untouched for decades. "Looks like you found another secret," Jack said. Ranger sat proudly. That evening, as darkness settled across the mountains, headlights appeared on the distant road leading toward the property. Jack stepped onto the porch and narrowed his eyes. A black SUV slowly climbed the winding path. Ranger moved beside him immediately. The vehicle stopped near the gate. The driver's door opened. Jack's expression hardened the moment he recognized the woman stepping out. Evelyn Hartwell. His former wife had come to the mountain. Jack stood quietly on the porch as Evelyn Hartwell closed the SUV door behind her. The mountain air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Ranger moved closer to Jack's side, his posture calm but watchful. Evelyn glanced at the dog and forced a small smile. He still remembers me. Ranger remembers everything, Jack replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The last time they had stood face to face had been inside a courthouse hundreds of miles away. Back then, Jack had left with almost nothing. Now Evelyn looked around the property and immediately noticed the changes. The repaired barn, the rebuilt fence, the garden, the fresh stack of firewood beside the cabin. You have been busy, she said. Turns out I had plenty of free time. Evelyn folded her arms. I heard people in town talking about this place. Jack nodded. Small towns do that. They are talking about more than the repairs. Ranger's ears lifted slightly. Jack already knew where the conversation was headed. Are they? Evelyn took a few steps forward. There are rumors about something hidden on this property. Jack remained expressionless. People love rumors. Do not do that, Jack. Her voice sharpened slightly. I know you found something. Ranger let out a low warning rumble. Jack rested a hand gently on the dog's neck. Easy. Evelyn looked toward the hill behind the cabin. A man named Preston Whitmore contacted me. Jack almost laughed. That explains a lot. He says developers are interested in this area. Of course they are. Evelyn met his eyes. If there is something valuable here, I deserve to know about it. Jack stared at her for several seconds before answering. 6 months ago, you told a judge this land was worthless. Evelyn looked away briefly. That was before. Before you thought it might be worth money? Silence followed. The wind moved softly through the trees. Finally, Evelyn sighed. You always did know how to make a point. Jack leaned against the porch railing. No. I just finally learned how to stop ignoring the obvious. Ranger sat beside him, never taking his eyes off Evelyn, she noticed. He really does not trust me. He trusts actions. Evelyn looked around again. The property no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. That realization seemed to bother her. You actually built something here. I rebuilt something, Jack corrected. Big difference. Another long silence settled between them. Then Evelyn spoke quietly. I made mistakes. Jack nodded once. We both did. That is all you have to say, she asked. What were you expecting? Evelyn did not answer. Perhaps she had expected anger. Perhaps she had expected regret. Instead, she found neither. Jack was simply calm, and that calm unsettled her more than any argument could have. Suddenly, Ranger stood and turned toward the cabin. He barked sharply, once, then twice. Jack immediately recognized the difference. This was not a warning bark. It was a discovery bark. Ranger sprinted toward the open cellar entrance leading down to the bunker. Jack frowned. What now? The German shepherd disappeared below ground. A few seconds later, another bark echoed upward from beneath the hill. Jack grabbed a flashlight from the porch table. Stay here if you want, he told Evelyn, or come see what Ranger found. Without waiting for an answer, he headed toward the bunker, and deep below the mountain, beyond the hidden steel door, they still could not open. Something had just captured Ranger's attention again. Jack descended the ladder quickly, with Ranger leading the way. The beam from his flashlight bounced across the bunker walls as he moved deeper inside. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn following, her footsteps hesitant against the steel rungs. Ranger stood beside the hidden door, at the far end of the bunker, barking sharply at the concrete wall. What did you find? Jack asked. The German shepherd scratched near the base of the door. Jack crouched and examined the area more carefully. For the first time, he noticed something he had missed before. A small metal panel had been hidden beneath decades of dust. Well now, he brushed it clean. A narrow key slot appeared. Evelyn stepped closer. Can you open it? Jack looked at the old journal still tucked beneath his arm. Suddenly, he remembered a page he had skimmed earlier. He flipped through the notebook until he found it. A handwritten note from Harold Callahan. The final access key remains where every Callahan learns to fish. Jack stared at the sentence. Then he laughed softly. Of course! Evelyn frowned. What does that mean? It means my father left me a clue. Less than an hour later, Jack and Ranger stood beside a small creek behind the property. The place was familiar. His father had taught him to fish there when he was a boy. Ranger immediately ran toward an old wooden dock that had nearly collapsed into the water. Jack searched beneath the loose boards. After several minutes, his hand struck metal. He pulled out a small rusted box hidden inside a waterproof container. Inside lay a brass key. Evelyn stared at it. You are telling me he left that there for decades? Jack smiled. Looks like he did. Back inside the bunker, the key slid into the hidden lock perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deep mechanical click echoed through the wall. Ranger stepped back. The steel door slowly opened inward. Cool air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Jack aimed his flashlight inside. The room was smaller than the main bunker, but far more organized. Metal cabinets lined the walls. Shelves held sealed records. At the center stood a large wooden desk. On top rested a single envelope. Harold Callahan, written in bold handwriting. Jack approached slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter was addressed to him. If you are reading this, son, then Ranger or another loyal friend finally helped you find what I hoped would never be needed. Jack smiled at the mention of loyalty. Ranger sat beside him as if listening. The letter explained everything. Project Sentinel Ridge had never been about money. It had never been about government secrets. It had been designed as an emergency support center for isolated mountain communities during disasters. Harold had spent years maintaining the facility because he believed people would always need a safe place during difficult times. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone. This place does not belong to one man. It belongs to everyone who may someday need it. Silence filled the room. Even Evelyn said nothing. Then a loud crack of thunder rolled across the mountains above. Everyone looked up. Another rumble followed. Jack walked to the bunker entrance and climbed halfway up the ladder. Dark clouds stretched across the horizon. The wind had changed. A major storm was moving directly toward Pine Ridge, and for the first time, Jack understood exactly why his father had spent decades protecting this place. The storm reached Pine Ridge before midnight. Heavy rain swept across the mountains while strong winds bent the tops of the pine trees. Thunder rolled across the valley like distant drums. Jack stood on the porch watching dark clouds swallow the ridges. Ranger sat beside him, calm but alert. The German shepherd's ears moved with every sound carried by the wind. Then headlights appeared on the road below. One truck, then another. Within an hour, several vehicles had gathered near the property. Families stepped out carrying blankets, bags, and worried expressions. Martha Hill climbed from her pickup and hurried toward the porch. "The creek is already rising," she said. "Some of the lower roads are flooding." Jack nodded. He already knew what needed to be done. His father had left clear instructions. "Open the bunker," he said. Ranger immediately jumped to his feet. Soon families from Pine Ridge carefully descended the ladder beneath the hill. Elderly neighbors, young children, farmers from nearby properties. The restored generator hummed steadily as lights filled the underground shelter. The room that had remained hidden for decades suddenly came alive with conversation and relief. Jack moved among the families, making sure everyone had blankets, water, and supplies. Ranger stayed close, greeting frightened children with gentle patience. One little girl wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. "He is brave," she whispered. Jack smiled. "He is." Hours passed while rain hammered the mountains above. Inside the bunker, people shared stories, drank coffee, and waited together. For the first time since discovering the facility, Jack understood why it had been built. It was never about secrets. It was about people. Near dawn, the storm finally weakened. The rain slowed. The wind faded. Families climbed back to the surface and stepped into fresh mountain air. The valley glistened beneath the first light of morning. The town had survived. Martha stood beside Jack on the hillside overlooking the property. "Your father would be proud of you." Jack looked toward the rising sun. "I think he would be proud of all of us." Nearby, Evelyn stood quietly beside her SUV. She had witnessed everything: the bunker, the families, the purpose her former husband had found. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she walked over to Jack. "I was wrong," she said softly. Jack looked at her but did not speak. Evelyn glanced around the property. "I thought value meant money." Her eyes moved toward the families preparing to leave. "I understand now that I was looking at the wrong thing." Jack nodded slowly. "It happens." Evelyn gave a small, sad smile. "You really do belong here. I think I finally do." She extended her hand. This time there was no argument, no demand, no claim. Jack shook it. A moment later, she climbed into her vehicle and drove away. Neither of them looked back. Weeks later, autumn painted the mountains gold and red. The bunker remained ready if anyone ever needed it again. The cabin stood stronger than it had in decades. The garden flourished. The barn was fully repaired. One quiet morning, Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee while Ranger rested beside him. The valley stretched peacefully before them. For a long time, neither moved. Then Jack reached down and scratched behind the German shepherd's ears. "You know something, partner?" Ranger lifted his head. Jack smiled. "I thought I came back here to disappear." Ranger's tail began to wag. Jack looked across the mountains glowing in the morning sunlight. "Turns out you brought me home so I could live again." Ranger leaned against his leg, and as the sun climbed higher above the Appalachian ridges, Jack Callahan finally understood that losing everything had led him to the one thing he truly needed all along: a purpose worth waking up for, a place worth protecting, and one loyal friend who never gave up on him. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.